Welcome, everyone. Welcome to tonight's University Forum. My name is Chris Benner. I'm the faculty director of the Institute for Social Transformation, and I'm a professor of environmental studies and sociology here at UC Santa Cruz. And I'll be moderating tonight's University Forum, which is here to celebrate the launch of Counterpoints, a San Francisco Bay Area Atlas of Displacement and Resistance. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We had over 160 people register for the event, so you can imagine yourself as part of a large group of people here to hear our panelists, or you could imagine being in an intimate, close gathering with some really incredible people who we're going to hear from in a minute. That's one of the beauties of Zoom meetings, is you can have both those experiences. As most of you know, the UC Santa Cruz University Forum is an ongoing series focusing on the relevance of work that goes on the campus to the broader community, and really looking at the socioeconomic, environmental, and political issues of the day, and proudly featuring the work and the impact of research conducted at UC Santa Cruz, along with partners really across the region, the country, and the world. Before we get fully underway, I do want to acknowledge that the land where UC Santa Cruz sits is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. And today, the Amamutsan tribal band, which is comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and to heal from historical trauma. And those kinds of land acknowledgements, in particular this one for UC Santa Cruz, is important for recognizing the history of stolen land and the continued presence of indigenous peoples and their enduring relationship to their traditional homelands and the long period of their struggles. And it's really important that land acknowledgement is not just a token gesture, but as an opportunity to reflect on and understand the history and experiences of settler colonialism in this part of the world, and the ongoing structures that are part of that, and the continued struggles to create a anti-colonial and more just future. So I really encourage you to look at the links in the chat to learn more about the Amamutsan tribal band if you don't know about them, and from whatever part of California or the world really that you're in, take a look at that native land link and learn more about the struggles of indigenous people where you're from. Before we really begin, I would also like to share a few details, more logistic details about the event tonight. We're using a webinar tool, so there's no chat function, but we do want to have the opportunity to interact with you. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom, and you can put questions in there at any point during the event. And for the last half hour or so, we'll have a chance for a Q&A session with all the people who will be here as panelists, and I'll come back at that point to help facilitate that conversation. Tonight's event will be recorded, so you can share it with others if you find it interesting, and I'm sure you will. It'll be up on our websites. So getting underway tonight, we're excited to be celebrating the launch of the book Counterpoints, a San Francisco Bay Area Atlas of Displacement and Resistance. And this brings together cartography, essays, illustrations, poetry, and more in order to depict gentrification and resistance across the San Francisco Bay Area. And in and of itself, it's an act of counter-hegemonic knowledge, as well as sort of counter-hegemonic knowledge making and activism. The work is compiled by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a data visualization, critical cartography, and multimedia storytelling collective that documents displacement and resistance struggles on gentrifying landscapes. And we'll put a link to the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project in the chat as well. So we're very fortunate tonight to be joined by two co-founders of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, who will be here to tell us a bit more about Counterpoints and the work behind it. So first I want to introduce Erin McElroy, who is a postdoctoral researcher at New York University's AI Now Institute, Artificial Intelligence Now Institute. And they're researching the digital platforms and technology used by landlords in order to surveil, evict, and racialize tenants. Erin is a banana slug. They earned their doctoral degree in feminist studies from UC Santa Cruz. And really excited, I just found out tonight that Erin recently got a job at University of Texas, Austin as assistant professor of American Studies. So we're really excited for that. And we're also joined tonight by Adrian Hall, who is a PhD student in geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Adrian earned her master's degree in public health at San Francisco State University. And Adrian has been with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project since 2016 and is a co-editor of the Health and Environmental Justice chapter of the Atlas. So without further ado, I will ask Erin and Adrian to turn on their videos, and welcome to the two of you. And I will turn it over to the two of you to tell us about Counterpoints, the San Francisco Bay Area Atlas of Displacement and Resistance.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for having us tonight. I'm Erin, and Adrian is here too. And it's really just an honor to be able to share this work with you all. The Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is a collective of many people, so we're just two representing a wider project, as well as the Atlas project, which we're thrilled to be able to release today. I'm going to just share my screen with you all. Great. Well, this is the lovely cover of Counterpoints, which neither of us designed. Issa Nafo, our designer for the Atlas, designed this, but I just wanted to share it. For today, what we're going to do is give you an overview of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, how we started, kind of the impetus behind the collective, and then we're going to go through the Atlas Counterpoints chapter by chapter, and then turn it over to some contributors that are also part of UC Santa Cruz. And that includes the Science and Justice Research Center's Just Biomedicine Project. And really, we also just want to thank the Science and Justice Research Center so much for really making this event happen. And of course, the university forum series as well. And then we're going to hear from Kristin Miller, who participated and contributed to the Transportation and Infrastructure chapter of our Atlas. And then we're going to hear from Professors Miriam Greenberg and Steve McKay of the No Place Like Home project, which the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project has also collaborated with, and which has been doing really important work in Santa Cruz, very much grounded in Santa Cruz geographies, fighting for housing justice. But without further ado, I'm going to start by just giving you a little background about what the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is and how we formed. And then we'll introduce Counterpoints. I'll start, and then Adrian will take it over from there. So the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is a collective that started in 2013 in San Francisco. Today we have chapters in Los Angeles, the wider San Francisco Bay Area, and in New York City. We're all volunteers. There are probably somewhere between 40 to 50 active volunteers with the collective. Everybody's in it because they're committed to housing and racial justice and committed to producing maps, stories, digital media, and counter narratives, fighting for housing justice and racial dispossession endemic to the different geographies that we're rooted in. So this is a snapshot of our website. You can find much more about our work on the website itself. But what we wanted to do is explain a little bit about the context in which we emerged in 2013. And so that was a moment, probably lots of folks here know it well, but in which the tech boom, the Silicon Valley tech boom, which had already disrupted San Francisco and wider Bay Area landscapes, in the dot-com boom of the late 90s and early 2000s, instigated a new form of gentrification that some people call the tech boom 2.0, or the second dot-com boom. But this was the era in which Airbnb, Uber, Twitter, and more started up in San Francisco, but it was also this moment in which real estate speculators began to really rebrand and remarket Bay Area landscapes, including those in San Francisco, Oakland, and other cities and suburbs, as places rich for the tech industry. So whether that was for tech employees to live and work, or for new startups to land. But what we started seeing as housing organizers was that our neighbors and community members, and even our, members of our own collective, were facing an increased rate of evictions, and folks were being forced out of the city. And so I myself got involved and helped start this group called Eviction Free San Francisco. And what we did was we organized various protests and worked with different tenants facing eviction to stop their evictions, putting pressure on landlords and real estate speculators. A number of direct actions in front of tech buses happened during that time, led by groups like Heart of the City Collective, Eviction Free San Francisco, and more. But it was really this moment that the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project formed. And at basically what happened was a few of us were in the San Francisco Tenants Union trying to figure out how to coordinate direct actions better against evictions, and realized that it was increasingly hard to figure out how to stop evictions, because it was really hard to figure out who the landlords were that were behind the evictions. And so this is the very first map that we made back in 2013, documenting the accumulation of a particular type of eviction in San Francisco, called the Ellis Act. The Ellis Act is a California-wide law that was invented in the mid-'80s after various cities in California gained rent control. And the Ellis Act was formed as rent protections and evict tenants for no fault of their own. And what we started to see was that a number of Ellis Act evictions were being filed by anonymous sounding shell companies, so LLCs and LPs, limited liability companies and limited partnerships. And it was increasingly hard for tenants to even know who was evicting them. So there would be stories of tenants coming into our Eviction Free San Francisco meetings, or coming into the San Francisco Tenants Union, describing, for instance, I have this friend Benito who came in once and said, "I'm being evicted by Pineapple Boy LLC, and I don't know who that is." And so we at the Mapping Project began doing research and figuring out how to identify who Pineapple Boy LLC was, and came to find in this case that it was the shell company for a real estate speculator housed at Vanguard Realty, which is a really big real estate company in San Francisco, the biggest in the Mission. So we started to produce digital maps, and also in this case, stencils that then tenants could use to mark properties that were evicted, to really help visibilize what I think the real estate industry hoped could remain an invisible process. We also started to create various profile pages on our website highlighting who serial evictors were, and the various LLCs and LPs that they used and operated under. So these are a couple example pages that we created on the right. And on the left here on my screen, you can see a new tool that we're working on that we haven't released yet, but that really comes out of this initial work that we began doing back in 2013. And this new tool we're calling Evictor Book. And what it enables tenants to do is look up an LLC or an LP or an address and figure out all the other properties associated with it, and the different evictions that these landlords have enacted. And this information is really important in organizing against evictions, but also in creating multi-building campaigns. So tenants in various buildings across these huge landlord networks can come together and organize and hopefully stop their evictions. So this is some of the work that we began doing early on. We also started about a year in and what we're calling the narratives of displacement and resistance wing of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. And there are many different iterations of this, but essentially we began doing storytelling work, oral history work, video work, zine making, mural making, filmmaking, in order to better understand complex geographies of eviction and personal stories of displacement, but also tactics the tenants have and continue to have and grow for resisting. And so, on the bottom right here, you can see a film we recently produced called Tenants Rise Up that documents different, it's really an homage to resistance struggles in Oakland, San Jose, and Santa Rosa. On the top right, you can see a mural that we made in Clarion Alley in San Francisco that highlights different stories of tenants who have fought back and who have been able to stay in their homes due to direct action. On the top left is the Black Exodus scene that actually Adrian is a key author of and might describe more soon. And on the bottom left is our online narratives of displacement and resistance web portal that houses all of the different oral histories that we've produced in the Bay Area. And there are similar versions right now in LA and New York, but we're focusing on the Bay Area here. So moving along, early on, we also got into producing reports with different community partners in the Bay Area. One of the biggest and most complex reports that we made, we produced and published with Tenants Together, which is a California statewide tenants organization, and a number of other community partners in Oakland, the city of Alameda and Fremont. And this was part of our effort to really ground ourselves more in the struggles in the East Bay. Early on in the project, we had wanted to be doing work on both sides of the Bay, but had a harder time accessing eviction data in the East Bay. And so we decided to produce this report, but we also wanted to highlight in the report, as you can see on the map on the top left, it's our community power map. And it was an effort for us to produce a cartography that highlighted not only loss, but also what community members were calling community assets and sites of power. And we did this to think about what's still thriving in the Bay Area and not just what's being displaced. And on the right here, you can see we released this report with many community members at the East Side Arts Alliance in 2016. And it was really in this moment following the release of this report that we realized we wanted to do more than produce a report. We were really interested in what producing an atlas might look like. And we wanted very consciously to think of what it would mean to decenter San Francisco and even decenter Oakland a bit in understanding Bay Area geographies of gentrification and resistance, while also acknowledging that much of our work thus far had taken place in San Francisco and Oakland. And so in 2016, we began putting our heads together, figuring out what would an atlas look like. We had a call for submissions for people to submit submissions, whether they be images, poems, maps, ideas or whatnot. And we got a number of amazing submissions. We started also reaching out to community partners that we had hoped to engage with in producing the atlas. And a very long process ensued. Right now, you can see the cover of the book. It's a 320-page book with over 200 contributions. Some of us who are editors for the atlas, you can see on the right, although there are many more. You can now buy it or pre-order it on the PM Press website. But the whole process of getting from the idea of the conceptualization moment of the atlas to the end product was a very long and windy road. You can just see here how many different people contributed to conceptualizing the atlas. This doesn't include all of the contributors. Like I said, there are over 200. But one of the sort of hard tasks we had was figuring out what the chapters would be. And we thought, what we could do is just have a chapter for each geography, but we wanted to think more thematically. And so you can see here the titles of the different chapters on the right and the chapter editors for each chapter. And we're going to go through the chapters now one by one to kind of explain what they are and why we came up with these as the chapters that we wanted to highlight in the atlas. So part of the task was, well, there were a few challenges we had. One was thinking more historically. So while we began, in this tech boom 2.0 temporality, we wanted to think about the longer history of dispossession and resistance in the Bay Area. And thus we have an Indigenous Geographies of Resistance chapter, but we also look at other formative events, whether that's redlining or urban redevelopment. We also wanted to think, like I said, more broadly in terms of the geography of the Bay Area. But then the other big challenge was we had been mostly producing digital maps, and we wanted to transfer and translate what might be an online interactive digital map into a graphic design materialization, which we found out was a lot easier said than done. And then I suppose the fourth greatest challenge was just coordinating so many different moving parts and people. So it took us 5 years, but we're excited that it is now almost ready to exist in the world. And you can, like I said, you can pre-order it now, and it should be shipping within a month or so from PM Press, which was the editor we worked with. PM Press is a local Oakland-based independent press, and it was really important for us to maintain our politics in our sort of publishing. So yeah, I'm going to now begin the chapter by chapter overview. I'm going to start by explaining the chapter. I was part of 2 chapters. I'm going to talk about them. I'll start with this one, and then I'll end with the other chapter that I co-edited, but Adrian's going to walk us through the chapters in the middle, including hers, but some of the other chapters as well from other chapter editors. But yeah, the very first chapter is called Evictions and Root Shock. I edited it, but it is not just my own work by any means. A lot of this work in the first chapter entails printed versions and graphic design renditions of maps that we had previously made digitally. It looks at themes such as root shock, which is a concept that Mindy Fullilove has well articulated as endemic to gentrification, but that some of the folks that we've interviewed in our oral history project, such as Edward Lindo, have also used to describe their experiences of gentrification in the Bay Area. On the right, you can see a drawing that an artist made of Edwin Lindo's story, where he describes what it was like to be pushed out of his own home in the Mission, and in which he also describes what it was like to begin being racially profiled by his neighbors as Bernal Heights in San Francisco began to gentrify. And that very first map that I showed you of Ellis Act evictions accumulating in San Francisco, on the left, you can see the map that we produced, in which we tried to simplify that and make it more accessible in a printed version. And on the left here, you can see the release party that we held for our mural when we released our oral history mural in Clarion Alley in the Mission. But I'm going to stop rambling and hand it over to Adrian to begin introducing the other chapters.
Yes, and I just wanted to quickly echo Erin's much gratitude to UC Santa Cruz and to the Science and Justice Research Center for contributing to the Atlas, for all the support for this project, and for all of our contributors being very patient and kind to us in a very lengthy process. And we're happy that this is finally being published. So the Atlas is coming. So the second chapter of the Atlas is titled Indigenous Geographies of Resistance, and it's edited by Savannah Kilner and Maggie Ramirez. And just to quote from their introduction to this chapter, all land in what we call the United States is indigenous land, and what is now known as the Bay Area spans the traditional, ancestral, stolen, and unceded territories of the Ohlone peoples. So this chapter is an important disruption of anti-eviction work by foregrounding urban indigenous women-led resistance, and to show how central settler colonialism is to urban dispossession and to understanding the Bay Area right now, and not simply prehistory. Savannah and Maggie worked closely with Karina Gold and Janella LaRose to develop this chapter. Just 2 images that we're highlighting here. On the left is a photo of a sign that reads Sagorate Land Trust and Planning Justice, honoring the land. And on the right is a map of Bay Area indigenous territories and languages. And we wanted to give a special thank you and shout out to Dr. Caitlin Kalia from UC Santa Cruz for contributing a piece titled Unsettling Domesticity, Native Women and US Indian Policy in the San Francisco Bay Area to this chapter. And so the third chapter in the Atlas is Health and Environmental Justice, which I co-edited with Maria Costa and Maureen Reese. And this chapter thinks broadly about the effects of displacement on health, along with the co-location of toxic waste in low-income communities of color, and how cleanup efforts in those same communities are often fuels for further gentrification. We are grateful for many contributions to this chapter, including a significant contribution from the Science and Justice Research Center, which you'll hear about a little bit later. Other contributors to our chapter include Poder, an organization in San Francisco that contributed a piece on community power mapping and bettering neighborhoods without displacing neighbors. The Asian Pacific Environmental Network and their work on environmental justice organizing in the East Bay, to name a few others. Several folks' multi-year efforts to get the American Public Health Association to declare public violence a threat to public health, which is actually a theme that we pick up in the next chapter. And just to describe the images on the slide, on the left is an image of a protest at the San Francisco Hunters Point shipyard, courtesy of Green Action. And we have lots of amazing oral history narratives about their work against environmental racism and displacement in the San Francisco Bayview. And on the right is a zine, a community gardening zine by Aliyah Shahid. So the next slide. The fourth chapter is Gentrification and State Violence, which was edited by Tara Graziani and Andrew Cizito and the AMP Collective. This chapter highlights the roles of policing, surveillance, and imprisonment in gentrification. It features an essay by Luciano Hamilton on gentrification to prison pipeline, which inspired the chapter. It includes several essays and visualizations on the criminalization of homelessness, sex work, police killings in Oakland and San Francisco, military contracts in the Bay Area, and just much, much more. Here on the slide is an image of two people holding a banner that reads "Gentrification equals violence," and some artwork by Matt Torres on abolishing ICE and the police. And on the right is a map of anti-homelessness laws throughout California. And so the next chapter, next slide. Thanks, Erin. So the fifth chapter is Transportation, Infrastructure, and Economy, which was edited by Delan Chan and John Stalin. This chapter covers 150 years of Bay Area infrastructure history and is centered on energy, employment, and transportation. The chapter features interviews with residents, maps of the region's water system, sewage system, energy plants, everything is in there. It's really amazing. And several resistance efforts such as protests by taxi drivers. Here on the left-hand side of the slide is a map of Bay Area commuter flows. And on the right is an image from a Google bus blockade from a piece by Leslie Dreyer. And we'll also be having Kristin Miller, who'll be talking further about her contribution to this chapter. The next slide. And so the sixth chapter is Migrations, Relocations, which was edited by Mary Shai and the AMP Collective. This chapter looks at how migration and relocation continue to shape the entire Bay Area region. The chapter features visuals on the uneven development through suburbanization and gentrification, immigrant geographies, segregation, resegregation, and of course, much more. Here on the slides on the left, we have a map of, and we're almost finishing, a map of voluntary migrations and forced migrations out of the region. And on the right is a timeline on Black exclusion in Alameda by Rashid Shabazz. And we're almost wrapping up. Erin will talk about the very last chapter.
Speculation and Speculative Futures, and I co-edited with Minissa Maharabal and other members of the mapping project. Chapter, we're really trying to think about financial speculation and the financialization of housing and how much speculative economies have impacted what we now think of as gentrification and eviction. And so there's amazing artwork. On the left, you see a poster by Fernando Martí. In the middle is a map by Alicia Cohart on histories of redlining and lending in Oakland. And on the right is an image by Finley Coyle, who illustrated different cycles of financialization and how they work, because it's often so abstract, and we really wanted to break it down and make it more palpable for folks who are trying to understand how speculation and financialization work. But we also wanted to think about speculative futures in a more emancipatory way. And so on the right is the very last map we have in our entire atlas. And it's actually my favorite. It was made by 4th and 5th graders from Guadalupe Elementary School in San Francisco. And they really re-envisioned what San Francisco landscapes might look like in a more emancipatory way. And so, yeah, you'll have to buy the atlas or find a way to access it online to read these stories and the narratives and to understand the cartography that the students came up with. But we really wanted to, again, flip speculation, financial speculation on its head, to think about speculative futures work from particularly a racial justice and decolonial perspective. And that aligns with the epilogue that was written by Maggie Ramirez. And this is a photograph she took, really reimagining Bay Area futures, thinking through histories of anti-Black racism and colonial violence, but to think about what Black and Indigenous-led futures might look like in the wider Bay Area. So yeah, those are the chapters. I just wanted to quickly let folks know, we finished producing most of the content for the atlas in 2017, 2018. It's taken us the last couple of years to do all of the work to get it in a state of being printed. So we don't have as much work as we wish we could have about what's happening in the current moment. Given that the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project has continued to do a lot of work to reflect what's happening in the current moment, particularly related to the pandemic and how much that's exacerbated existing housing injustice locally and also globally. But we've also been really excited about all of the housing organizing that's been going on, that's really building upon a longer history of resistance. And so you can just see some images here of different work that we've done and different ways that participants can contribute stories and information, and also take pledges to stop participating in cycles of gentrification and resistance. I'm not going to get into all of this now, but feel free to check out some of this work on our website. Yeah, and there's I would just also say if people do want to get involved, it's really best to figure out what's happening in your neighborhood. And if you do have a local tenant association or tenants union, and plug in, but we wanted to kind of signal to that as well. But without further ado, I want to introduce some of the contributors to the atlas. So you can see here, we're going to hear from the Just Biomedicine collective based out of the Science and Justice Research Center. Then we're going to hear a little bit about transportation, infrastructure, and economy from Kristin Miller. And then we'll hear from the No Place Like Home project by Marian Greenberg and Steve McKay. But I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can better introduce the Science and Justice Research Center. And just give me 1 second. Okay. So the Science and Justice Research Center's Just Biomedicine Research Cluster, overseen by the Science and Justice Research Center's founding director and sociology professor Jenny Reardon, with the University of Maine professor Catherine Weatherford Darling, contributed a chapter within the public health chapter that Adrian is a co-editor of. So they contributed a chapter within a chapter entitled Just Biomedicine on 3rd Street, Health and Wealth Inequities in San Francisco's Biotech Hub. This chapter examines the different visions for health and healthcare that have been imagined and practiced along the 3rd Street corridor of San Francisco. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Catherine Weatherford Darling. And I also just want to give thanks to the undergraduate and graduate student researchers and alumni who are part of this collective, including Waseed Barrett, Dennis Bro, Emily Carmelli, Amy Coffin, Hannah Feingold, Laura Lopez, Emma Mitchell-Spark, Andy Murray, and Nikobi Petronelli from Feminist Studies. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine.
Great, thank you so much for having us all here, and just such deep thanks to Erin and Adrian and everyone who has put this book and collection together to really bring and spark some really amazing conversations. So let me just figure out where my slides are. And thank you, Erin, for acknowledging all of our fabulous undergraduate and graduate student alumni that Dr. Reardon and I have had the pleasure to work with on this chapter and in this project. It's been, such a joy to see our students contribute and help imagine this work. So when we think of mapping health, we might imagine first a map like this, right? Showing a zip code levels of inequalities in diabetes. And we know that decades of research on fundamental causes of health have shown us that whether we're mapping diabetes or cancer or COVID-19, we would see similar patterns of inequality by geography, race, and socioeconomic status, right? And these maps are incredibly important to visualizing health inequity. And in our chapter, we take a bit of a different angle to mapping health to really start to map and interrogate biotech speculation and the rise of molecular biomedicine as central to the institutional and social determinants of community health that shape inequities like you see on this map, right? So what does it mean to think about biomedicine as a structural barrier to health, right? And in our chapter, we describe how financial and ideological investments that in an imagined future of medicine are changing the political landscape and the built environment and the neighborhoods in which people live in the Bay Area, right? In our contemporary moment, right? And over the past 5 years, right, in which we were researching or are researching these transformations, right? So really asking how are the technological, medical, and political, economic transformations, right? How are they reorganizing the spaces, the places, the landscapes, and the horizons and the practices of biomedicine, public health, and healthcare, right? So you'll see here on the sign, in the image, a banner heralding the future site of Chase Stadium and UC San Francisco, clinical buildings and parking structures in the background, right near the intersection of 3rd Street and 16th Street, right? Where we're welcomed to the future and the future of medicine, right? And in our chapter, we take a longer view to this historical transformation of this place and of biomedical institutions to ask about how this future became concrete, to ask critical questions about who it's for and who and what gets displaced in the process. Right, and we do that with a concept from medical sociology, the concept of healthscapes developed by Adele Clark to grasp at these patchy, unequal, and stratified ways that people and institutions go about doing the work of health. Right, so this concept helps us trace how the landscapes of health and healthcare are shaped by historically situated, geographically distributed and socially stratified cultural practices, right? So what are we doing when we're doing health, right? And part of what we find and are tracking, right, is the way that health becomes a core site of venture capital investment, philanthropic investment, and public investment, right? So in 2016, venture capitalists invested $4.4 billion in California biotechnology, 70% of which was concentrated in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, right? So we're also talking about big economic divides in the rural-urban axis of inequality, right? University of California, San Francisco boasts $5.4 billion in revenue, a $2.3 billion endowment, and an $8.9 billion regional economic impact, right? So in this brief snippet of our larger chapter, I'll talk about 3 key places on our Healthscape map that help highlight the contradictions, the tensions, and the forms of resistance taking place, right, as in and through this biotech boom. So we'll touch on the UC San Francisco Mission Bay campus, the Arthur Coleman Medical Center, and the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital, right? Each with entwined histories of place, space, and health that are really shaping and being shaped by these histories of public and profitable healthscapes, right? So first we'll talk about UC San Francisco's Mission Bay campus, which arose out of a previously abandoned rail yard, right? And really the sort of gears started turning here when the railroad company turned real estate company partnered with the city to develop the land in the 1970s, right? And so fast forward to 1994, the Mission Bay plan reimagined this former marshland and former rail yard as a biotech hub, right? So I won't go through the history since 1980, right, of the biotech revolution, right? But we discuss in detail some of the ways that the new clinical and research buildings at the Mission Bay campus really cemented a vision of cutting edge, data-driven, individualized healthcare called precision medicine, right? And biotechnology, big data science, and revenue from an elite medical center was all seen as a new California gold rush, right? And UCSF, as well as city and state leaders, claim to have revitalized the quote once blighted area of the city, right? All through the ways that biomedical innovation created or came to be seen as an economic engine, right? These buildings also symbolize a reconciliation between, after a long protracted patent dispute between biotechnology company Genentech and UCSF, right? And really crystallized or cemented this merger between the city and county of San Francisco, the university, tech philanthropists like Salesforce Benioff and Facebook Zuckerberg, right, and the biotech industry, right? That all of those institutions became intimately connected, right, through the corridors and the halls of these buildings, right? And while this biotech gold rush was taking shape around the Mission Bay neighborhood, right, just 3 miles south along that 3rd Street corridor, rapid biomedical expansion, right, meets a rich and long history of Black health activism, right, and resistance to systemic medical neglect, right? So documented histories of restorative health practices from African-American civil rights movements are generated here on the other end of 3rd Street, right, that have a long history of challenging these dominant narratives of biomedical progress, right, in which that promise innovation and healthcare for all, for everyone, right? And so one of the buildings that we highlight on this end of the street, right, is Arthur Coleman Medical Center, which is the current home of Bayview Hunters Point Clinic. Established in 1960 by Dr. Coleman, it was really a response to exploitation and medical violence experienced by Black patients in other healthcare settings or in white dominated healthcare settings, right? And it was one of the first Black-owned medical practices in the neighborhood, right? In 2016, the Coleman family lost the building in a tax lien, and only through community resistance and battling for the right to preserve the building as a historic landmark was it enabled to remain as both a historic landmark and a medical clinic, right, rather than another use. And just to highlight this interview quote from a Black community health leader, right, told us that the fight for the Coleman building, right, is one in a long history of people fighting to keep Black healthcare alive. Right, so back down the street a bit to Potrero, we can see the layered histories of biomedical infrastructure that are visible at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital, right? Here, concerns about seismic retrofitting led to an $887 million ballot initiative to rebuild the hospital in 2008. And when it was opened in 2015, it donned the names of Zuckerberg and Chan, whose $75 million donation would shake up the very meaning of public health at the hospital, right? And as you can see here from the interview with a nurse protesting the name change, right? That rebranding was not without controversy. This nurse explained to us, yes, Zuckerberg gave 75 million, but the people of San Francisco paid nearly 900 million. They sold us out cheap when the people of San Francisco are paying more than 10 times as much as the 6th richest person on the planet. And the goal of Facebook is to privatize literally and figuratively. I really think it's more than a metaphor. It's stealing our identity as a public institution, right? So here the public hospital symbolizes a professed commitment to community care for all, while failing to address the really root causes of inequalities, right? Including poverty and housing deprivation. And all of that is happening while invisibilizing the very public identity of one of the nation's few remaining city-operated and publicly owned hospitals, right? So in the image you see here, the act of protest, the nurses are reclaiming the city's hospital, right? Marking out the philanthropist name. So in and through our chapter, as we're thinking through health, place, and displacement and resistance, we're drawn into questions about the cultural, social, and political space occupied by health, right? What do we think about? What can we think about when we think about health, right? So here in the image, you'll see just across the train tracks from UCSF Mission Bay, community members built a street encampment known as Box City, right? And it was destroyed as many street encampments were across the Bay Area, even while in 2017, more than 7,000 San Francisco residents were unhoused, right? And so displacement as we're seeing it in the image, right, is happening right up against the gleaming buildings of UCSF Mission Bay, right? But this kind of displacement isn't just about pushing people aside, right? It's also about taking up imaginative space, right? And filling, right, filling out who and what we can think about when we think about health, right? And following Dr. Ruha Benjamin, here we can see that our imaginaries of health and biomedicine are also a battleground, right? They're the political and cultural terrain in which we're defining and redefining what it's possible to think about when we think about health and when we think about the public. So as Dr. Benjamin provokes us here, right, we must be just as inventive about addressing social complexity as we are about biological complexity. If our bodies can regenerate it, let us not imagine that our body politic is so utterly fixed, right? So the maps like the ones that we were thrilled to contribute to Counterpoints and that we're thrilled to think alongside, right, force us to ask critical questions about the kinds of life and the kinds of health we can imagine and build in San Francisco and in biotech hubs across the globe. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing there.
Okay, so I would like to introduce Kristin Miller, who will talk about their contribution to the Transportation, Infrastructure, and Economy chapter. Kristin Miller is a PhD candidate in sociology at UC Santa Cruz with a designated emphasis in film and digital media, and has an MA in media, culture, and communications from NYU. Her research concerns the role of Silicon Valley futurism in reshaping the Bay Area, and she studies cities, environmentalism, and technology with interests in science fiction, film, and TV, and utopian studies. Kristin contributed a map that shows the routes of Google buses and is one of a few maps in that section that all illustrate different aspects of transit, fragmentation, and privatization in the Bay, as well as the need for a more cohesive regional understanding of mobility in the area.
Thanks, Adrian. To start, I'd also just like to say a quick thanks to Erin and to Anti-Eviction Mapping and to the editors for including me in Counterpoints, and also to the organizers of today's event. I'm really glad to be here and I'm really excited to see the atlas in print finally. So my contribution to Counterpoints, as mentioned, is in transportation, infrastructure, and economy. Let me just get the screen share going. It's one of a number of maps that address the transportation history of the Bay Area. I came to this topic, so my PhD research, as mentioned, concerns the effects of Silicon Valley ideology on the material infrastructure of the region, particularly, as you can hopefully see in this quote from one of the biggest name venture capitalists, the tech community's general culture of disdain for physical place and space in favor of dispersed networks and cloud technologies. I came to this topic in part by becoming aware of the networks of the private buses that the big tech companies use to move their employees around the region. These buses quickly became contested, as you've seen in some previous pictures, for their perceived role in dispersing and accelerating gentrification and the affordable housing crises related to the tech economy, which Erin has discussed. While served by public transportation, the Bay Area is a difficult and time-consuming area to travel around without a car, generally necessitating changing between at least 2 different transit systems, often with seemingly uncoordinated schedules. So you can see in this map by Spur, which is also included in this chapter of Counterpoints, Spur is an urban planning and research think tank in San Francisco. There is a patchwork fabric of 27 separate transit agencies that move people throughout the region, which is a lot, and it's pretty sprawling and uncoordinated. And while I was learning about this and then also trying to learn more about the tech buses and their routes and their frequency, I stumbled upon an internal Google document, which was not password protected, and which listed the locations of all the then existing company bus stops. So I grabbed that data and then worked with another UCSC grad student, Matt Jameson, who's a cartographer, to map them and condense those stops into likely routes to and from various points in the Bay Area and the Googleplex and Mountain View. And as you can see, as of the middle of the last decade, the Google bus routes extended from Santa Cruz and Morgan Hill in the south all the way to San Rafael in the north. It's a massive system, which up until the COVID-19 pandemic only continued to increase in size and frequency. And Google is actually only one of many companies in the tech world, including Apple, Facebook, Yahoo, Genentech, and many others, that had or has a bus program of this scale. There was another map which circulated widely in the media at the time I was doing this research, produced by cartographer Jake Coolidge, which you can see on the left here, which showed what the BART system, or Bay Area Rapid Transit System, might have looked like if it had been built on its original planning documents from the 1950s. This map is also included in Counterpoints. And this sort of fantasy version of the BART system includes a complete circuit of the Bay, as well as stops in Silicon Valley all the way down to San Jose, and a line across the Golden Gate Bridge into Marin County. This is, of course, very different from the much reduced BART system that was ultimately built, which you can see on the right, and is in striking contrast also to the spur map that I showed previously, when you consider that just one coordinated system could have linked a region now served by 27 separate agencies. It was also very difficult for me not to notice, as I mapped the footprint of the Google bus stops, that it looks much more like the original proposal for the BART system than BART itself does. The Marin spur of BART was scrapped early on, and funds for the Silicon Valley line were diverted to highway construction, and it was ultimately supplanted by Caltrain. That's a much longer story for another time. But what I had hoped to show by mapping the Google corporate shuttles in this way, and by depicting them using the aesthetics of a transit system schematic, which was a deliberate choice, is that I think it's easy to see that the big tech companies recognize, as did the early BART planners, that the Bay Area is a very highly interconnected urban region in need of transit that seamlessly links its 3 large cities and 9 counties. But as John Stalin wrote in the introduction to this chapter of Counterpoints, rather than use their immense economic and political power to build a coalition for regional transit expansion and consolidation, tech firms like Google have simply built a parallel system for themselves, which I think is something that is troubling and has motivated a lot of my research. The numbers pre-pandemic bear out that what these tech companies have done is in fact a separate transit system operating within the Bay Area. As of 2020, there were over 1,000 private shuttle buses operating in the region. And that, I think it says here that it would constitute, if all of the buses were taken collectively, it would constitute the 7th largest transit system in the Bay Area. I will stop there, but I hope that this backstory has conveyed some of the uses of mapping as a form of argument and contestation. And thanks very much. Erin and Adrian are now going to introduce Professors Miriam Greenberg and Steve McKay of the No Place Like Home project, which I built the website for, and which uses data visualization and mapping to address the affordable housing crisis in Santa Cruz.
Thank you so much, Kristin. Yeah, I'm so glad to be able to have your contribution in the Atlas, as well as Miriam Greenberg and Steve McKay's work on the No Place Like Home project. So the No Place Like Home project was overseen by sociology professors Steve McKay and Miriam Greenberg, and they contributed a visual summary and map from their large-scale study of the affordable housing crisis for Santa Cruz tenants. The map helps amplify how the uneven geography and demography of the county is reflected in and by inequalities on critical issues such as rent burden, overcrowding, and forced moves and evictions. The survey results also provide a springboard for the study's wider discussion of local and regional policy options in addressing the housing crisis, particularly for renters. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them. Yeah.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for including us in this wonderful celebration of Counterpoints, and congratulations on the publication of Counterpoints. We're really thrilled to be involved. Steve and I are going to go back and forth, kind of talking about our piece in the Atlas, and then the project that it's part of, the larger project that Erin is talking about, that it's a part of. First, again, wanting to just to acknowledge and thank the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, Adrian, Erin, and the large cohort of activists and media makers and scholars and residents who were a part of this group and continue to be. At the time that we created this map that is in the Atlas, together with Finley Coyle from the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, we were in the early stages of developing the No Place Like Home project, and we were very much inspired by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. Erin was a PhD student in feminist studies and was speaking in my classes frequently, and we were very inspired by this collaborative approach that they were taking, the kind of radical approach to cartography and data visualization, and its connection to like really deeply rooted and collaborative community-based research. And this was also dovetailing with some work that Steve will talk about that we had been doing in the sociology department, community-initiated, student-engaged research, and the recognition that the housing crisis in Santa Cruz was really a kind of a center point for so many other crises. As the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project itself shows, it was integrally linked to issues around racial justice, around environmental justice in our region, and economic inequalities, and was just continuing to expand. And so we wanted to use similar kinds of tactics, really, of mapping and research to visualize and analyze the scale, scope, and impacts of this crisis for our region, its intersection with these other environmental, racial, and economic issues, and to use this, as we recognize was being done in our wider region, to help with organizing a burgeoning housing movement, as a tool, as a resource for our community partners and for this fledgling movement. And in doing that, we were quite aware that in some cases, Santa Cruz is not quite on the map of the greater Bay Area all the time. And that's not only the fault of the Bay Area. Sometimes Santa Cruzans themselves see themselves as somewhat off the map, as somewhat anomalous in terms of the crisis, or they might look at many of the honestly quite distinctive concerns we have here, whether it has to do with being, such a beautiful tourist destination, whether it has to do with the location of the university. And we focus on a lot of those kind of local roots and don't necessarily see ourselves as part of this larger greater Bay Area and Silicon Valley rooted, Tech 2.0 has been discussed, rooted crisis that we're dealing with as well. So we really see the confluence of those issues. And as this page discusses, we are the least affordable, we were then, we continue to be the least affordable small city in the US. And that's not only to do with these local issues, it has everything to do with this confluence of the local and this larger regional condition, as well as, questions of national housing policy as well. It's also the city with the highest rate of homelessness in the nation, and a city, part of a larger county that has 60% renter population, where as research we were beginning to do in terms of surveying these renters was showing, are off the charts in terms of facing conditions of rent burden, forced moves, overcrowding, and major problems with their housing. So we really sought through this project to see ourselves as part of this larger region, and also grapple very much locally and with local organizations in reckoning with the scale and scope and complexity of our local crisis, in hopes that we could contribute to struggles to organize and mobilize around this issue. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk about what this initial map turned into and the current report that we're producing.
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. And yeah, thanks for the organizers. So out of the early maps, really, we wanted, it was a strategy to think about how do we do research that's actually useful? How is it locally useful, but also tied to these larger, kind of structures and processes, both in terms of, what's creating the problem, but as the, counterpoint says, how does resistance look and what kind of data do they need? And so the project we did it over 3 years from 2016 to 2018, end of 2018. And we're just now, we put the website so they can put that in the chat. And we're just finally, and there you can really see a lot of the maps we use. So again, inspired by Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, we worked with Erin Cole, who's here on campus with the Center for Integrated Spatial Research, helped build these really great maps that you see just here a snapshot of, but they're much more interactive, so we can look at rent burden, overcrowding, forced moves, and major problems. But we can also look at across different demographics and different neighborhoods. And so we won't go into our results, but you can explore it on the website. And we've just finally put together, it takes a while to do these final reports, but it will be published this month, I hope, by the Institute for Social Transformation. They'll be posting, and we'll also post on our website, the final report. And really, in it, we pick up these key issues that also are really focused on in the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is, rent burden. And one of the things we found, and here you see that 70% of people were rent burden, meaning they're spending 30% of their income on rent. But we found two other categories. One's in the extreme rent burden, which is 50%. And we found just by surveying, and we did this project again as a scissor project we call community initiated student engaged research. And for us to get the scale of to collect the data that we did, which was 2,000 surveys, over 250 undergraduate students went out to public places and door to door and all these different neighborhoods to ask people and get this data. And we found that we had to create another statistical category for those spending 70% of their income on rent, and that we named it obscene rent burden. And we found significant, about 25% of people we talked to, right, were spending that much of their income on rent. So the project again was meant to be to collect the data, but also to use that data to start a conversation about how did we get here and where do we need to go. And so Miriam's going to talk about how then the data was used.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, so we really saw this very much as an action research project, and like this larger atlas, I think using different forms of data and research, historical research, policy research, as well as the data we were gathering through surveys and mapping, to be a part of the larger political engagement around housing policies and housing struggles. So, and at the time, this was building towards the elections in 2019, and the efforts around the 2018 and 2019 around rent control in Santa Cruz was a big flashpoint, and many people involved in the organizations we were partnered with, as well as among students, became a part of this effort for the first time since the early 1980s to have a rent control passed in the city of Santa Cruz. Similarly, and at the same time, there was an effort countywide to have a housing bond passed in order to raise funds for the production of more housing in Santa Cruz, Measure H. So measures M and H were on the ballot, and there was all of this kind of momentum building around that. And we were also at the same time having public events with hundreds of local attendees to share the research findings. So it was really a wonderful opportunity, together with the kind of beginnings of the Institute for Social Transformation and the Social Sciences Division, to really bring the research that we were doing with the students and our partners to the broader community. And ultimately, of those initiatives, M was clearly by far the most controversial, the most divisive in our community in the city. It was, by the way, part of around around a dozen similar initiatives statewide that were on the ballot, and a statewide initiative to try to overthrow Costa-Hawkins, to try to really enable local communities and cities to pass a rent control more easily in the state, and overthrow this kind of preemptive law that's statewide. Ultimately, it was not successful. Measure M was not successful. There was over $1 million in money that came from the State and National Apartment Association, the State and National Association of Realtors, in conjunction with local landlords and homeowners, and a very powerful local movement to overthrow the No on M campaign that you can see images of here. And it's an ongoing struggle. The question of what are the policy responses, to this ever expanding crisis, as we'll be talking about. The failure of M, we see as having played a role in the COLA campaign by graduate students on our campus in 2020, which was a major campaign that also spread to most of the other UC campuses across the state. And I think we'll turn it over there to thinking about, the situation now in the aftermath of these campaigns.
So one of the things is to think, well, what could have been, given that we've had, if anyone's been paying attention, just in the last year, how much rents and purchase housing in Santa Cruz has skyrocketed. So you can see here, we're one of now the 10 hottest markets in March 2021 right now. But look at the other places. Santa Cruz now, the median house cost is $1.2 million, up from $900,000 just in a year. And in most hot in terms of this from the realtor.com is how fast things are going. So they're listing, and they're being, even at that cost, right, 4 to 5 times what other hot markets are, it's still going that fast. Again, something you can't understand without the connection to the Bay Area and the impact the remote working has had. And the other effect we see is just in terms of median rents. And here, this is really important because a lot of the local folks were blaming the university and students for driving up rents. But in the last year, all of them exited. They're not even in town. Yet we see, since our project started in 2016, as of 2021, there's been an 88% increase, right, in rents. So when we started the project, we started listening, and this is according to HUD, $1,600 for a 2-bedroom. The data for this year is now $3,021 for HUD, and that's the fair market rent. So that's actually only at the 40% level. So again, this is the context in which, had we had some regulation, right, or built more affordable housing, maybe things would be different. And so just wanted the last thing we did, and Miriam's going to tell you a little bit about where we've taken this so far.
Yeah, well, and just quickly, and I know we're running out of time and we want to get to discussion, but we most recently have been working with fellow faculty colleagues through the Faculty Senate, as well as graduate student researchers, to create this latest data visualization, which is the Graduate Cost of Attendance and Living Calculator, which draws from other similar kinds of cost of living calculators. And we analyzed a number of these. We did focus groups with graduate students to try to think about what best captured the reality of trying to survive here and live here, both to attend the university and to get your studies done, and all the costs that you might bear as a student, and whether professionalization costs and other things, as well as to live here off campus. And there's very limited options to living on campus, although that is also an option here. And so we enable users of this calculator to factor in all of those costs. And as you can see in the image on the right, so a standard 1 adult with 2 children in half of a 2-bedroom house with a car, which is kind of the classic situation many people are in, is looking at $3,770 a month. And this helps, we hope, people who are current students, who are prospective students, to kind of grapple with the reality of the costs here, as well as to think about how this kind of data, as was going on with the COLA campaign, might be used in upcoming negotiations, contract negotiations, and other upcoming campaigns. We should say, you know, we're hopeful and in conversation that this could be a model that could be extended across the UC campuses and other university campuses. It could also be extended beyond, not just for graduate students, but for undergraduate students potentially. It would obviously have to factor in other kinds of things, as well as for faculty and staff, and really thinking about what is the cost of maintaining our lives here and our research here, and you know, the efforts of maintaining a public university system under conditions like these. And so I think we're really grateful that we can share this in the context of Counterpoints, and thinking about, you know, just the broader need for marshaling our abilities to use data visualization, to use mapping, to use all of these combined skills to really help people to visualize and analyze the realities as well as political possibilities of what it means to try to live under these kinds of conditions of a housing crisis.
So thanks, and we'll stop there. So
well, wow, and I want to invite all the panelists to turn your videos on and come back. And we have some time now for discussion and question and answers. And just to start by, you know, an incredible round of applause for all of the work that you all have done. And if we'd been in person, you'd hear the tremendous crowd of people acknowledging that as well. I'm going to bring in some questions from the audience in a second. And just a reminder that if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A tab. But what I actually want to start with is with Erin and Adrian. And part of that is making visible the incredible labor that goes into producing a volume like this. You know, I've had some experience, you know, being part of edited collections, and just the logistics of herding cats to get things in and responding to requests to put it together. But what you've put together here, along with the full collective and all the others that are part of it, is much more complex than a regular edited book, where there, you know, a somewhat standard, you know, grammar and getting points across in prose or analytical work, because you've got all sorts of visual representations of maps and photos and you know, different demonstrations and stories behind them with the texts that are part of that. And I'd love to hear you two just talk a little bit about, and maybe it's part of sharing stories, is, you know, how do you think about working with the contributors in putting together materials that are part of this broader process? Because of course, visual representations can be incredibly powerful, but also, you know, quite highly contested potentially. So I'd love to hear you just talk a bit about that process of putting together this incredible collection. And either Erin or Adrian, whichever wants to start with that.
No, thank you for that question. It's I think Adrian and I could probably talk for days about this. So maybe I'll start and then pass it over to Adrian. But also just thank you so much to Steve and Miriam and Kristin, Kate, for your contributions. The atlas is so much richer for them. But yeah, I mean, it was challenging to say the least, and I think we've been particularly, we were really hoping to get it out sooner, but I think just the nature of the atlas meant that it needed to take the amount of time that it took to get out. But it really was herding cats, which was also a generative experience, but a difficult one. And I think really each of the 7 chapters in the atlas could be its own book in terms of like, and even that would be a rigorous process to produce, I think, in terms of the 20 or so contributions, sections or chapters within each chapter, and each of those often has, you know, text, photography, maps, so forth and so on. And it was a lot of work to put everything together. And I think to think where things fit thematically, and to work with each contributor on their piece to figure out how to, whether it was translating a digital map into print or creating a new map from scratch. And then there's all the work of layout and design. But even the cover, which, you know, I think we had about a 6-month process within our collective figuring out what cover we wanted, and, you know, meeting every couple of weeks and voting on covers and brainstorming cover ideas. So, I mean, it was really that sort of attempt at consensus amongst our collective that I think made it a really generative and rich process, but also, you know, a necessarily slow process. But yeah, I don't know, I'll turn it over to you, Adrian.
I don't know that I have much to add, other than I would like to say that we had a very systematic process for editing, but there are just so many folks involved, and, you know, so many that we can't even name here. There's just so many, there were so many moments for sort of internal reviews and feedback from contributors that we even, you know, totally retitled chapter names and rearranged the book, and a lot of work to solicit things that we felt like were missing, you know, after we even had an initial draft. So, I think that's one benefit, that there's so many people involved, that we had a lot of eyes and a lot of opportunities for tough conversations and feedback, and also that we give ourselves the leeway to say that, you know, this was made at one moment, and some of the maps that I made, you know, I would totally redo now that I've learned more about cartography, but it's kind of, you know, it's where we were at that time, so that's okay too.
Well, it's great to hear that. I want to bring in a question from Jesse that sort of ties into this a bit, which is, you know, bringing it up to date a little bit. And when you started, Erin, you talked about, you know, the work of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project has been continuing, and it's clear from the stories from all of you, and this is a question for any of you, that this contribution to the Atlas is part of an ongoing engagement with organizations and issues in different contexts. And Jesse's question is, how do you think the pandemic and ensuing eviction protections and rent strikes has impacted opportunities for housing organizing in the Bay? And I guess I might broaden that a little bit to say, you know, how do you think your work in representing and doing these maps and visual representations and the works you're working with has evolved up to the present day? So I leave that for any of you to jump in on.
Yeah, no, I think that's also a really important question. I mean, one thing that, I mean, it's been a really, really hard year. I mean, I can't even get into all of the loss and the struggle that, you know, tenants have really borne the brunt of within the Bay Area, but beyond, you know, throughout the US and really globally. But I think one of the heartening things that I've seen is just this sort of new wave of tenant associations forming and multi-building organizing and rent strikes and also mutual aid. That, you know, it's not new, like, but there were really rich, you know, kind of backbones for that already because of the long history of tenant organizing. But I think there's been even more, and I think that's really important. Beyond, I mean, also, you know, we were fighting for years for eviction moratoriums. Now we have them. They're certainly not strong enough, but that also comes out of a really long history of policy organizing, and new solidarities and old solidarities really forming. And even within the mapping project, we were really working pretty distinctly in our 3 chapters in the Bay Area, New York, and LA. And in part because we've all switched to meeting on Zoom all the time, but also in part because the pandemic has shown the necessity of solidarity across regions. We've been doing more what we're calling inter-chapter collaborative work across our chapters, and have folks contributing from an array of places. So we have this map looking at different policies and also rent strikes and forms of housing justice organizing globally, and have worked with some community partners in Rome, in Romania, and in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. So that was, for us, new. We never had done international work before, and we began doing more work to think about what it means to create a map with internationalization built in terms of language justice, which is something that we had always wanted to do but never had actually figured out. So yeah, things like that, I think, and that's just our own collective. Yeah, I don't know if others want to add more to that. But
I just wanted to say, in Santa Cruz, at least, I mean, what we see is the absence of that backbone in terms of the inequality of accessing the resources for tenant protections that come at these wider scales, right? So what we're seeing really locally is fearful immigrant families who, because of public charge, are also afraid to avail themselves of rental protection. And so so there's a real need to do tenant organizing. It was just getting off the ground and got kind of squashed under the anti-M stuff. And that absence we've seen in the widening disparity of which renters are able to take advantage of pandemic support.
I'd be really interested, Kate or Kristin, in your perspective. One of the things that your stories that you were telling really helps make clear that displacement happens in multiple arenas, displacing public transit with private transportation systems, displacing public health institutions with privatized institutions in the health industry in different ways. And I wonder if either of you could reflect a little bit about how you think sort of the last year and the work that you're doing on those issues has changed people's perspectives on that public-private relationship.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Hopefully I'm not frozen here. I'll just keep talking. Yeah, we've learned so much about the ways that we've really evacuated our concept of public health and eviscerated our public health infrastructures, right, over the 30-year period. That, as Erin mentioned, has been deadly and devastating, and and we are all collectively grieving and trying to rebuild from, right? And I think one of the things that I continue to learn from the stories in the history of biomedicine in San Francisco, right, is that we need to rebuild as much as reimagine and reclaim, right, that space of the public, and to really teach and train our health equity leaders in different ways, right, to demand accountability and transparency in different ways, right, and really to be innovative in our governing, right, as well as in our technical systems, right, and that's something that I have learned from Dr. Reardon and the Science and Justice Center, right, that we need ways to form new collectivities and new publics around these problems. But yeah, but it's as much a question of our political will and imagination, right, as our technical prowess and our data.
Kristin, what about you? I'd be interested in your perspectives on sort of updating your story to today.
Yeah, I think currently there are just still so many unknowns in the realm of transportation. Ridership is down everywhere. And it's a space that has been largely abandoned in many ways by the people who can afford to do so, who have other means of transportation available to them over the course of the past year and change. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next 3 to 6 months over the course of the next year. I think there's a real need, I was just saying, for reasserting the kind of political will to reinvest in public transportation and the sort of need for collective spaces. But I have a lot of concern that when it comes to transportation, what we're going to see is a doubling down of the kind of quarantine logic that we had pre-pandemic in the case of something like the buses, right? That we have these sort of technologies that are, privatized and sort of enclosing of spaces that would otherwise be public. The buses are one of the other things I'm looking at is the push for the self-driving car, and the replacement of sort of collective forms of mass transportation with these kind of individualized little pod versions of mass transportation. And from pandemic reality, it seems all the more appealing. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens going forward.
Well, unfortunately, we have ran out of time. So I just want to wrap up by thanking you all again for the work that you're doing and the ways that you're communicating these key issues to a broader public. Kate, your points about the Science and Justice Research Center's effort to create broader publics, both in our public institutions and the broader population, I think is really important. And the ways you're communicating that beyond the standard academic, journal article, I think is so important in terms of communicating these issues to a broader public. So again, those of you who are still with us, I would really encourage you to go online and order Counterpoints, this atlas. And just want to thank all the people that made this event possible. Of course, all of you as panelists for the work that you do, also the Science and Justice Research Center, all the team at University Relations and the University Forum, as well as the Institute for Social Transformation. And please do join us for the next University Forum, which is June 1st. The topic is the art of leadership, managing humans in the 21st century. It's a conversation between the Dean of the Baskin School of Engineering, Alexander Wolf, and an alumnus from UC Santa Cruz, Michael Lopp, who is now with the title of Engineering Leader at Apple Computers. So it should be a really interesting conversation. And with that, thank you all. Go buy the book, the Atlas, it's really important. Good night.